All right, so I'm going to try to share briefly what the Enneagram is all about because it's just such a powerful tool and relevant, very relevant to this experience and this journey. So the Enneagram is, for all practical purposes, a personality test, but it blows Myers-Briggs and True Colors and a lot of the other ones that I've seen out there out of the water, in my opinion. And the reason is that it gets the underlying why we feel, think, and do certain things, as opposed to just the what. And the basic premise of this, so there are 9 personality types, and the basic premise of the Enneagram, so you take the test. There's like 150 questions in the long version, and there's a shorter version. And it gives you your dominant type, and then there's others. And essentially the premise of it is that every child wants unconditional love. I mean, every adult for that matter, but starting in childhood. And because of the way we're wired, sankaras, the way we perceive things, we start assuming the love is conditional on something. So for example, a type 1 will assume if I'm perfect, they'll love me. 2 assumes if I give, I'm generous, they'll love me. 3, I'm a 3. If I accomplish, they'll love me, etc. So there's a hook that the child starts assuming that love's conditional. Now, it's not about whether you have good or bad parents. It's not about any judgment here. It's about understanding. You could have 2 kids in the exact same environment, end up as totally different personalities because of the way they're wired and what they assume that love's conditional on. So that becomes the core fear. And the personality starts to evolve around it. And anytime that fear is triggered, you go back to this concept of trauma, anytime that fear is triggered, there's an emotional reaction, magnitude of which depends on how much it's triggered. And then, you may have autonomic response or go into fight or flight and have, or aversion and craving takes you into fight or flight, and now you might have autonomic response. So, as an example, and what they say is, what they shared with me when I first learned it, probably about 15, 20 years back now, is that, so when I did the test and I got the results back, I was like freaked out when I saw it, because it was like, wow, they're saying things about me that it was so resonant when I did it. There are things that I would never even put on, much less say out loud, or I wouldn't even put on paper. I wouldn't say it out loud. So I was like, I'm going to burn this paper before I go home. It was talking about like all these things about my personality. Of course, my husband already knew all of these things about me, but in any case, and one of the things that of course, the woman that was showing it to us on this voyage that I was on said, I know you're freaked out, but here's some things to think about or realize. That everybody's one of the types. You're not a freak of nature. There are a million other people in the world who are like you. It's not about like, I like this and I don't like that. So as an example, I'm a type 3. So I have a fear of, wanting to be accomplished. And essentially then it was like, anytime that got triggered, I would have a reaction. So I'll give you an example. And let me give you the context in which they suggested it, that I started seeing the pattern. So they say is that you might say, I like this and I don't like that, but it's not about picking and choosing. You can think of it almost as a mask that you pick up when you're born that covers your true essence, who you are. And it's got the good, the bad, and the ugly. You can't pick and choose. It's like a mask that, if people can pick up, will pick up. Everyone picks up one. And so the key is, can you just start to look back at your reactions to things when you get triggered and see if you can relate it back to the core fear. So, it doesn't work if you have judgment. It'll just tighten its grip on you, the personality. But if you can just observe it and see if you can relate it back to the core fear, it'll start to loosen its grip. And then you'll start to see through essence. So type 3, for example, is more childlike, which is kind of what's happening to me. The more I heal and see the patterns, I feel more like a child, more childlike, not childish, but childlike. And so essentially, as an example, let's say, I get into an argument with my husband. Then once I cooled off, I look back to see what happened. I was like, oh, he said something that triggered my fear of accomplishment. He's made some comment about, and I had an emotional reaction. I started getting to an argument with him. And so then what started happening over the course of a few months is that, it would be like in the middle of the argument, I'd see somebody would remind me, like a little guy would remind me, like, there's the pattern. And then before I'd get into the argument, I started seeing the pattern. Before I'd have the reaction, I'd feel anger or something before I'd get it. So essentially then you start moving backwards in time from the trigger. You might have to, if you start this practice of looking at it with a therapist on a weekly basis, or with family and friends, or yourself, if you can start to reflect on the things that trigger you, you'll start to see these patterns. And this is what I was doing with my kids that I mentioned in the first video of why I ended up leaving Google. This is what we started doing. We started seeing patterns. You start to see those are your sankaras, those are your traumas. And just simply becoming aware of them is very powerful. It'll actually, just like I experienced, you'll start to, and it won't happen overnight. maybe 9 out of 10 times you freak out. That's progress. The magnitude, duration, and frequency of your emotional response will slowly start to come down. We're talking about change of neural pathways, so they won't change overnight. But essentially, you start to see a shift occurring. You start seeing these patterns. So, I'll give you a couple of applications of this that I found to be really useful. So when I worked with the Enneagram Prison Project in San Quentin Prison. It's a maximum security prison. And I remember the founder, Susan Olesic, had introduced me to another type 3 when I went to the prison. And these are all like, max security prisons, so they're, rape, murder, armed robbery, really, really heinous crimes. And introduced me to this type 3. And so he was speaking with me, and as I was observing him, listening to him, it suddenly dawned on me, he sounds just like me. The way he thinks, the way he expresses himself, the things that motivate him and trigger him. But he's here for murder. And initially I was like, I don't want to be associated with this person. And then what occurred to me as he was continuing to share was that what I learned from Susan was that most of these inmates have had really scary childhoods, severe, extreme trauma. So if you think about that core fear, and when it gets triggered, that fear is so magnified that when they get triggered, they get violent. It's so autonomic. They can't control themselves. They do these really, violent kinds of things as an autonomic response. So essentially then they end up in prison. So it's circumstance. I had a pretty decent childhood. He had a pretty horrible one. Maybe that's the only reason he's behind bars and I'm not. So there was it was very humbling. And it was just a realization that maybe we're more alike than we realize. And this relates back to a number of other things that around addiction that I'll share in another video, the power of addiction. And you can also take a look at the routine that I did with the kids in the video on why I left Google. But just want to share a little bit about the Enneagram. And so the thing to do is start looking at these patterns and seeing if you can understand them. So I used to, because I have a fear of accomplishment, and I'm a type 3, so type 3s are always looking for a sense of belonging, and I never felt like I belonged. And so I would always assume people reject me, exclude me, etc. And when I started looking at the pattern, they'd ask various questions, notice the number of times you expect to be excluded or rejected. And when I started observing it, it was dozens of times. Well, that's not even rational. And then the thought occurred to me, it's maybe this isn't reality. Maybe this is my perception of reality. And that's the truth. Oh, that's reality. But essentially, it's how we see the world. So when you start taking a look at these patterns, Michael Levin talks about this too. It's as cells start to, groups of cells continue, every cell, he found that basal cognition, so intelligence at the cellular level, and hallmarks of intelligence like problem solving, memory, and learning. But as you get groups of cells, ultimately we started as a single cell and we become a multicellular organism with a greater collective intelligence because you have, all of these smaller intelligences coming together. When you heal trauma, you're taking those fragments, which fragment us into a bunch of entities instead of a single. You lose some of that intelligence. And when any one of them arises, you only have the intelligence of that smaller being, that version of you that comes up when you're triggered. And, as I mentioned in a previous video, if the trauma or the sankhara becomes large enough, it's like a being within you that has a voice that you hear, can become like screaming voices or like Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, complete personalities that take over. When you get triggered, your subconscious shuts down and that part of your subconscious takes over. And so essentially, it's really all about starting to see these patterns. And Michael Levin, his latest publication, talked about how these entities, as they grow, these collection of cells, they start to develop patterns, emotional behavioral patterns. And we know from trauma that when you create a trauma, it's a fragment in your system, certainly psychologically, but even physically, you end up with knots. If you look at Vipassana and these Buddhist principles, a knot, a tumor that Michael Levin talks about, is simply a group of cells that's separated from the whole and has a separate goal. So your trauma also is a fragment with a separate goal, and it's got thoughts, emotions, sensations, all the characteristics of the experience embedded with it. Starts to develop patterns, and as it gets bigger and bigger, even emotional behavioral patterns, even has a voice. It's like a being within us. And so essentially then, this is what it's all about, is starting to see the patterns and see the character, the sankhara, the trauma. And then just seeing it becomes powerful enough. And it's tuning into that. And then you can start to do more deeper healing methodologies to actually continue to resolve them, like Vipassana, but there are many, any equanimity to sensation. So when it gets triggered, can you observe and not react? This is the key. And you may not be able to. It's autonomic. So you have to do it when you cool off later in the day or later in the week. You look at it, observe it, see if you can see the pattern. And then what you start doing over time is essentially, there's 3 stages that I've noticed. So initially it's like, so I was left brain most of my life. The power came from tuning in to the language of the right brain, the subconscious, emotion and sensation. And I started to see these patterns. And I learned the Enneagram, so it helps you accelerate. So it's not meant to put you in a box, simply to point you in the direction of what are some patterns that might be relevant to you. All of us have our own set of triggers and motivations, patterns, emotional behavioral patterns that are unique to us. But there might be common characteristics. So it helps you, kind of points you in that direction much more rapidly. So you don't have to go do it all from scratch. I mean, you could do it from scratch. I do this with kids, and my own kids I started with. It's like we started seeing patterns in our own reactions. Wow, every time someone says this type of thing or this type of character or this type of comment or this environment, I somehow seem to get triggered. I get angry or sad or scared, so you'll start to see those. And it's not about fixing it. That's one of the things I said. If you try to fix it or heal it, solve it, the personality would get a tighter grip on you. The traumas will get bigger in your system. So essentially, it's really about having self-compassion, patience, and really just acceptance, just observing it. And this is what they teach us in Vipassana. It's not about reacting to it if you can help it. You may not be able to help it, because if your conscious mind shuts down and it's strong enough with sankhara or trauma, autonomic response kicks in. You can't control it. But you can look at it later in the day or in the week or whatever. And then slowly you'll start being able to notice things like soon after and even during and even before they happen. You'll start to see these patterns. So the phases that I talk about, I'm going to share for another journey, but they're basically 3 phases that you can use to advance the ability to see the patterns and how to reduce and remove them. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks so much.